He had closed billion-dollar mergers in glass towers above Manhattan, negotiated hostile takeovers on private jets, and stared down rooms full of men who feared his signature, but none of Ethan Whitmore's money, power, or influence meant a thing on that cold stretch of Texas highway when his Bentley shuddered once, flashed a warning across the dashboard, and died beneath a sky turning black with rain. For the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore was completely stranded. His fingers tightened around the leather steering wheel as he pressed the ignition again. Nothing. Just a dry clicking sound and the mocking glow of dead electronics. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath, glancing at the signal bars on his phone. No service. Of course. 40 miles from Dallas, somewhere between scrub fields and rolling fence lines, the CEO of Whitmore Industries sat alone in a $300,000 luxury car that now looked as useless as a museum piece. Wind swept across the pavement, rocking the vehicle slightly. In the distance, thunder rolled low like a warning. Ethan loosened his silk tie, irritation hardening his jaw. This was not how his day was supposed to end. In less than 12 hours he was expected at the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, the kind of polished black-tie event where cameras flashed, donors smiled, and newspapers printed his carefully crafted image beside words like visionary, philanthropist, and titan. But none of those titles could restart an engine. He stepped out of the Bentley, Italian loafers crunching against roadside gravel, and lifted the hood with all the confidence of a man who had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. Steam whispered upward. Rows of polished machinery stared back at him like an expensive foreign language. Ethan exhaled sharply. He hated feeling incompetent, and in that empty stretch of highway, with storm clouds swallowing the last orange strip of sunset, incompetence was exactly what he felt. A pickup truck approached from the distance, old enough that he heard the engine before he saw the headlights. Ethan straightened. The truck slowed, then pulled onto the shoulder behind him with a squeal of tired brakes. For a brief second he considered waving it on. He was not used to being the man who needed rescuing. Then the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out wearing faded jeans, worn brown boots, and a plain grey sweater that looked 2 winters old. Her brown hair was tied back in a low ponytail, and rain mist gathered lightly across her shoulders. She couldn't have looked more ordinary if she tried. Yet there was something strangely steady in the way she closed the truck door and walked toward him, as if lonely highways and broken cars were inconveniences she'd met before. "Car trouble?" she asked. Her voice was calm, low, almost casual. Ethan glanced at her, then at the dead Bentley, suppressing the sting of embarrassment. "That obvious?" She gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Only because your hood's up and you look like you want to sue the engine." Ethan almost laughed despite himself. "Almost. It just died," he said. "Electrical system maybe. I've already called, tried to call, roadside service." She looked at the phone in his hand, then at the empty bars. "No signal out here for another 10 miles. Ethan stared. "You know this area?" "Enough." She stepped closer to the Bentley and peered under the hood without asking permission. Ethan instinctively shifted, uncertain whether to stop her. This woman looked like she should be dropping off groceries, not touching the internal systems of a handcrafted British luxury car. He said carefully, "This vehicle usually requires specialized diagnostics." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved once across the wiring, once across the battery housing, then settled on a loose connection hidden near the fuse panel. The silence stretched. Wind moved through the roadside grass. Somewhere overhead, thunder cracked a little closer. Then she reached into the pocket of her sweater, pulled out a small screwdriver, and said quietly, "Specialized doesn't always mean complicated." Ethan frowned. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, this simple woman standing in drizzle beside an old pickup truck would walk into his marble ballroom and make every powerful person he knew forget how to breathe. Grace Miller leaned over the engine with the kind of quiet concentration that made Ethan instinctively step back, though he still watched her with visible doubt. Raindrops tapped softly against the Bentley's polished frame while her fingers moved with surprising confidence, checking one cable, tightening another, then pressing the loose fuse housing back into place with the small screwdriver she carried as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Ethan folded his arms. "You do this often?" he asked, unable to hide the skepticism in his tone. Grace did not look up. Enough to know when somebody spent too much money on features and not enough on practicality. Ethan blinked. For a moment he was not sure whether she had just insulted the car or his entire lifestyle. Before he could respond, Grace reached through the open driver's window. "Try it now." Ethan slid behind the wheel, pressed the ignition, and the Bentley roared back to life instantly. Dashboard lights flickered green. Climate control returned. The digital console glowed as though nothing had ever happened. Ethan stared at the steering wheel in disbelief, then looked back at her through the rain-speckled glass. "That is impossible." Grace stepped away from the hood and lowered it with both hands. "No," she said softly. "Just a loose power relay." Ethan got out again, his polished shoes now soaked from the wet shoulder, but he barely noticed. Men in his world charged consultants $500 an hour to tell him things they barely understood, yet this woman in a weathered sweater had solved in 90 seconds what would have taken his dealership half a day and an expensive tow. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. "Please," he said, sliding out several crisp $100 bills, "at least let me pay you for stopping." Grace glanced at the money, then at him, and shook her head. "You looked stranded. That is all. No one stops on highways for free anymore." "Some people still do." Her answer landed with uncomfortable simplicity. Ethan stood there holding cash that suddenly felt oddly useless. Grace turned toward her pickup truck, but another growl of thunder rolled across the sky, louder now, followed by the first hard drops of rain. Within seconds, the drizzle became a sheet. Grace looked west, then back at Ethan. "You should not keep driving." Ethan frowned. "I have to get to Dallas." "Not through Cedar Ridge Pass in this weather," she replied. "Mudslides shut that road every time we get a storm like this." Ethan checked his phone again. Still no signal. Rainwater darkened his sleeves. "Wonderful." Grace opened her truck door. "There is a diner 2 miles up the frontage road. Dry coffee. Hot food. Working landline if you are lucky." Ethan hesitated. Every instinct in him resisted climbing into an old pickup with a stranger, but standing in the rain beside a recently dead Bentley while daylight disappeared was not a better option. Grace seemed to read the calculation on his face. "Suit yourself," she said, climbing in. Ethan looked at the empty highway stretching in both directions, then exhaled and locked his car. 30 seconds later he was sitting in the passenger seat of her truck, knees slightly cramped, the cabin smelling faintly of motor oil, peppermint, and clean laundry. The contrast to his handcrafted leather interior was almost comical. Grace pulled back onto the road. For a minute neither of them spoke. Windshield wipers scraped steadily across the glass. Finally Ethan loosened his soaked tie and said, "Ethan Whitmore." Grace kept her eyes on the road. "Grace Miller." He waited, expecting recognition. It never came. Most people in Texas business circles knew his name. Many changed their tone the moment they heard it. Grace did neither. She simply nodded once as if he had told her he sold insurance. Ethan found that strangely irritating. "You are not going to ask what I do." Grace made a slow turn onto the frontage road. "Does it change whether you needed help?" Ethan looked at her profile in the dim dashboard light. Calm eyes. No curiosity. No performance. No attempt to impress him. He was not used to being around someone who seemed completely uninterested in his importance. And as the little diner sign appeared through the curtain of rain ahead, Ethan Whitmore felt the first faint crack in something far more fragile than his car's electrical system, his certainty that people could always be measured at a glance. The diner looked like the kind of place time had forgotten, a narrow building with flickering neon, fogged windows, and a hand-painted sign that promised the best pie in 3 counties. Grace parked beneath the awning and stepped out without hurry, pulling her sweater tighter against the rain. Ethan followed, glancing once at the mud splashing near his imported loafers before deciding they were already ruined anyway. Inside, warm air wrapped around them along with the smell of bacon, coffee, and cinnamon. A waitress in her 60s greeted Grace with an easy smile. "Evening, honey." Grace returned a small nod. "Storm caught us." The waitress looked at Ethan's tailored suit and expensive watch, then back at Grace with mild amusement, as if she had already built a story in her head. "Booth by the window is free." Ethan slid into the cracked red vinyl seat across from Grace, feeling absurdly out of place beneath humming fluorescent lights. He checked his phone again. Still nothing. "Do you have wireless internet?" he asked the waitress. She laughed. "Sir, we are proud to have ketchup bottles from this decade. Let us not get ambitious." Grace lowered her eyes, hiding what looked suspiciously like a smile. Ethan exhaled and set the phone down. This was becoming humiliating in ways no boardroom ever had. The waitress poured coffee into 2 thick ceramic mugs. Ethan stared at his. "I did not order anything." Grace lifted hers. "You looked like you needed it." He should have refused on principle. Instead, he took one sip and was irritated to discover it was excellent. Rain hammered the windows now, blurring the parking lot into silver streaks. For several minutes they sat in silence, broken only by the clink of dishes and the low murmur of country music from an old radio near the kitchen. Ethan studied Grace more carefully. She was not trying to make conversation, not trying to impress him, not dropping hints that she expected gratitude or reward. Most people who recognized opportunity around wealth became chatty very quickly. Grace seemed perfectly content with quiet. "So," Ethan said. "Finally, you just drive around rescuing strangers." Grace stirred one packet of sugar into her coffee. "I was delivering supplies." "Supplies?" "Medicine. Blankets. Things people forget rural clinics still need." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Volunteer work." "Something like that." Her answers were short enough to stop further questions, but not rude. Ethan found himself oddly determined to make her explain more. Before he could try, the diner door opened with a gust of wet wind and an elderly man shuffled in wearing a faded army jacket. His beard was thin, his shoulders bent, and he carried the tired look of someone who had learned not to expect much kindness from the world. He approached the counter and quietly asked the waitress for the cheapest meal on the menu. Ethan barely glanced at him. Grace did. Without saying a word, she stood, walked to the register, and handed the waitress a folded bill. The older woman nodded as if this was not unusual. Grace returned to the booth as though nothing had happened. Ethan watched the exchange. "You paid for him?" Grace shrugged. He looked hungry. "Do you always do that?" "When I can." Ethan leaned back, studying her face. There was no self-congratulation there. No saintly performance. Just matter-of-fact decency, the kind that did not ask for witnesses. A minute later the waitress brought the veteran a hot plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and pie. The man looked toward the room, confused, then his eyes found Grace. She gave him one small nod. His expression softened into silent gratitude. Ethan looked down at his untouched slice of pie and felt something unfamiliar pressing against his polished sense of order. He had donated millions through foundations, signed checks with cameras nearby, and accepted applause in hotel ballrooms, yet this woman had just done more with one unnoticed gesture than half the charitable speeches he had given in the last decade. He was still turning that thought over when the diner door swung open again and a woman in a cream trench coat rushed inside, holding a phone and an umbrella. Her sharp blonde hair was perfectly in place despite the storm. Caroline Pierce had arrived, and the second. Her eyes landed on Ethan sitting across from Grace Miller, her expression tightened in visible disbelief. Caroline Pierce stopped just inside the diner doorway, water dripping from the edge of her umbrella, her eyes moving from Ethan Whitmore's rain-damp suit to the cracked vinyl booth and finally to Grace Miller sitting across from him in a faded grey sweater. The disapproval on Caroline's face was immediate and almost theatrical. "Ethan," she said, hurrying over in narrow heels that clicked sharply against the old tile floor. "I have been trying to reach you for 45 minutes. The board is in panic mode. The gala coordinators need final approval, the press team is asking about your statement, and your driver is halfway to Cedar Ridge looking for you." Ethan rubbed a hand over his forehead. "My car died." Caroline set his buzzing spare phone on the table and only then seemed to acknowledge Grace with a brief glance so polished it felt colder than outright rudeness. "I see someone found you." The wording was subtle, but the meaning was clear. Someone, not a person worth naming. Grace lifted her coffee and said nothing. Caroline turned back to Ethan. "The tow service is on its way for the Bentley. I also had Marcus bring your overnight garment bag because the gala begins at 7 sharp tomorrow and we cannot afford another scheduling disruption." Her eyes flicked once more toward Grace's muddy boots beside the booth. "I assume everything is handled now." Ethan looked between the two women. Something about Caroline's tone made the warm little diner suddenly feel smaller. "Grace helped restart the Bentley," he said. Caroline blinked once, then gave a practiced smile that carried no warmth at all. How resourceful. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a business card, and slid it halfway across the table toward Grace with 2 fingers. "Thank you, If there are any reimbursement expenses, fuel costs, roadside inconvenience, whatever applies, my office can process it." Grace looked at the card but did not touch it. "I did not stop for reimbursement." Caroline's smile tightened. "Of course. Still, it is best to keep things efficient." Ethan noticed the waitress glance over from behind the counter, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Even the veteran at the corner table paused with his fork midway to his mouth. Caroline had a gift for making rooms feel stratified, everyone silently sorted into categories of significance. Grace, apparently, had already been placed at the bottom. Ethan cleared his throat. "Grace also brought me here because Cedar Ridge Pass is closed." Caroline checked her watch. "Then we should leave immediately. Marcus can circle back for your car after the tow." She looked at Grace again, this time with the distant courtesy wealthy institutions reserve for anonymous helpers they plan to forget within minutes. "Thank you for your assistance tonight." Assistance. Not kindness. Not rescue. Just a transaction Caroline wished to conclude. Grace slowly reached for her coffee, then nodded once. "Drive carefully. The frontage road floods after mile marker 12. Caroline gave a distracted hum that suggested she had not truly listened. Ethan stood, but before following Caroline, he pulled several $100 bills from his wallet again and set them near Grace's mug. "Please," he said quietly, "I insist." Grace looked down at the money, then pushed it back across the table without even counting it. "Buy blankets for the Cedar Ridge Clinic instead. They need them more than I do." Ethan stared at her. Most people would have snatched the cash, thanked him too loudly, and maybe asked for a photo. Grace treated his money the same way she had treated his name, as something fundamentally unimportant. Caroline shifted impatiently beside him. "Ethan." He slipped the bills back into his wallet, strangely aware that he was the one feeling diminished. "At least let me get your number," he said. "So I can thank you properly." Grace finally looked directly at him. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "You already said thank you." Then she rose, walked to the register, and quietly paid for the veteran's meal before Ethan could object. As she signed the receipt, Ethan caught only a glimpse of the name written in neat deliberate letters, G. Miller. Something about those initials tugged faintly at his memory. Like a half-heard note from an old song, but Caroline was already guiding him toward the door, umbrella raised, urgency in every clipped movement. By the time Ethan looked back through the rain-streaked window, Grace Miller was standing beside her old pickup truck, calm as ever, while he had no idea that the woman his assistant had just dismissed would be the single most important guest at his gala the following night. By the time Ethan Whitmore arrived at the Whitmore estate just outside Dallas, the storm had passed, but the strange discomfort Grace Miller had left behind had not. The mansion glowed with warm exterior lights, every trimmed hedge and stone archway arranged to project the exact kind of effortless prestige magazines love to photograph. Staff members moved quickly under the porte-cochere as Marcus took his luggage and Caroline launched straight back into tomorrow's schedule without allowing Ethan so much as 10 seconds of silence. The mayor confirmed attendance. Senator Holloway wants FaceTime before the donor auction. The press from Financial America requested a statement about the expansion fund, and your speech still needs final revision. Ethan walked through the marble foyer loosening his cufflinks, listening but not listening. His mind kept circling back to a rain-soaked diner 2 counties away and a woman who had pushed away money as if it were no more persuasive than napkins. Caroline noticed his distraction almost immediately. "Are you even hearing me?" Ethan stopped halfway up the staircase. "Who is on the anonymous founder list for tomorrow night?" Caroline frowned. "I am sorry. The legacy founder recognition. The donor we have been trying to identify for 10 years. The one the board insists might finally appear in person." Caroline blinked, clearly thrown by the abrupt question. "We still do not have confirmation. The invitation was accepted through legal representation only, same as every year." "Why?" Ethan hesitated. He was not entirely sure why he had asked. Those initials on the diner receipt had lodged in his memory like a burr. G. the Miller. Somewhere in the back files of Whitmore Foundation there had been signatures like that. Quiet transfers, emergency grants, patent release agreements, all routed through shell correspondence and always signed the same way. He remembered because the board had spent years speculating over who their most generous invisible benefactor was. "No reason," he said finally, though the answer felt dishonest even to him. Caroline narrowed her eyes. "This has something to do with that woman, does not it?" Ethan gave her a cool look. "What woman?" "The roadside mechanic saint from the diner." Her polished voice carried a faint note of ridicule. "Ethan, with respect, random acts of small-town kindness are charming, but we have a $3 million fundraising event in less than 24 hours. I would prefer not to build strategic decisions around truck stop sentimentality." Ethan should have agreed. Normally he would have. Caroline Pierce was efficient, ruthless, and almost always correct where logistics were concerned. Yet something in the way she reduced grace to a forgettable roadside anecdote made irritation flicker behind his ribs. "She was not sentimental," he said. Caroline gave a thin smile. "No, apparently she was very good with jumper cables." Ethan said nothing. Caroline took his silence as dismissal and moved on. "Wardrobe fitting is at 8. The event photographer arrives at 9. Also, I had security tighten guest verification. Last year too many +1s slipped through donor reception." Ethan resumed walking upstairs, but those last words hung strangely in the air. Tighten guest verification. The next morning unfolded in the usual blur of custom tailoring, board calls, floral previews, and speech edits. Crystal chandeliers were lowered and polished. White orchids arrived by the truckload. Servers rehearsed wine service beneath ceilings painted with imported gold leaf. By late afternoon, Whitmore Hall had transformed into a cathedral of wealth, every reflective surface designed to remind guests exactly who held power in the room. Ethan stood at the top of the grand staircase in a black tuxedo while donors in gowns and pressed suits streamed across the marble floor below. Caroline moved through the ballroom with a tablet in hand, directing. "Staff with military precision. Anonymous founder still has not checked in," she informed him. Ethan nodded, though he barely heard her. He did not know why he kept scanning the entrance. He certainly did not expect to see an old pickup truck woman among oil executives and philanthropists. And yet, when a slight figure in a simple navy dress stepped through the revolving doors 40 minutes later, hair tied back, posture calm, carrying no diamonds and no visible hunger for approval, Ethan Whitmore felt his pulse stop for one clean second while Caroline Pierce turned toward the entrance, took one look at Grace Miller, and smiled the kind of smile that always meant someone was about to be quietly humiliated. Grace Miller did not belong in Whitmore Hall by any visible social measurement, and Caroline Pierce noticed that before Grace had taken 3 steps across the marble floor. Around her shimmered a sea of satin gowns, black tuxedos, diamond earrings, silver trays, and conversations priced in stock portfolios. Grace wore a simple navy dress with long sleeves, modest heels, and no necklace beyond a thin silver chain that disappeared beneath the fabric. She looked composed, but unmistakably plain beside women who treated luxury as a competitive sport. Caroline intercepted her with the polished speed of someone who had removed undesirable variables her entire career. "Good evening," she said, her smile crisp enough to cut paper. "Guess name." Grace met her eyes. "Grace Miller." Caroline tapped quickly on the digital list, though Ethan, watching from halfway down the staircase, knew she had already judged the answer before the screen loaded. Caroline frowned with theatrical professionalism. "I am afraid donor admission is restricted to registered sponsors, board members, and invited guests with credentials." Grace reached into her purse and removed a cream envelope. "I was invited." Caroline took the envelope, glanced at the embossed seal, then at Grace again. "This is a general foundation invitation. Those are distributed to many outreach recipients." The word recipients landed with quiet insult, placing Grace among charity cases rather than benefactors. Few nearby guests slowed just enough to listen while pretending not to. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in the room, that invisible current created whenever wealth senses someone might be out of place. Grace spoke evenly. "I was told to arrive before 7:30. Caroline lowered her voice, but not enough to keep the exchange private. "And I am telling you this evening is a private donor function. If you are here regarding grant assistance, the Public Foundation office opens Monday morning." One man near the champagne tower gave a faint amused cough. A woman in emerald silk turned fully now, openly curious. Grace stood still, hands folded over her purse, offering none of the fluster Caroline was clearly expecting. "I am not here for assistance," she said. Caroline smiled wider, the kind of smile that only appears when humiliation is being served on silver. "Of course. Then perhaps there has been some misunderstanding." She motioned discreetly toward security near the entrance. Ethan descended 2 more steps without realizing it. Something about this scene hit him with uncomfortable déjà vu rain on diner windows. Cash pushed back across a table. The same woman being politely categorized as insignificant. Grace glanced toward the ballroom, taking in the chandeliers, the donor banners, the floral displays carrying Ethan's family crest. Not envy. Not intimidation. Just quiet observation. "I can wait," she said. Caroline shook her head. "I would rather not create confusion among our sponsors." The sentence was smooth, but every syllable meant the same thing: you do not belong here. Security began moving closer. Guests now openly watched, conversations dimming into that expensive hush only privileged rooms know how to produce when embarrassment becomes entertainment. Ethan opened his mouth to intervene, but before he could, Caroline handed the cream envelope back with 2 fingers. "There is a side reception lobby across the courtyard where community visitors can leave contact information." Grace looked down at the envelope, then slowly lifted her eyes. "Community visitors," she repeated softly, as if testing the phrase. Caroline nodded. "Yes." The room waited. Many expected Grace to apologize, retreat, maybe mumble something about receiving the wrong invitation. Instead, Grace simply tucked the envelope back into her purse and stepped aside from the doorway with almost unsettling calm. No anger. No pleading. No scene. That composure made the moment sharper, not softer. Ethan had seen powerful men shaken by less. Caroline turned, satisfied the inconvenience had been managed, and signaled for the string quartet to resume. But at that exact second, the chairman of the Whitmore Foundation stepped onto the ballroom stage, tapped the microphone twice, and smiled broadly at the assembled donors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing beneath the chandeliers, "before dinner begins, we have the extraordinary honor of welcoming the anonymous founder whose private contributions built this institution from the ground up. Miss Grace Miller, would you please join us at the front?" The room did not merely quiet. It froze. For one suspended second, no one in Whitmore Hall moved. The violinists lowered their bows mid-note. A champagne server stopped with a silver tray hovering inches above his shoulder. Conversations that had filled the ballroom with expensive laughter vanished so completely that Ethan could hear the soft hum of the chandeliers. Caroline Pierce remained standing near the entrance, one hand still extended from where she had just dismissed Grace Miller, but all color drained from her face in a slow visible wave. "I am sorry," she whispered, though no one had asked her a question. The chairman smiled warmly from the stage, entirely unaware that he had just detonated the social hierarchy of the room with a single sentence. "Miss Miller," he repeated, gesturing toward the front, "without your 10 years of anonymous endowments, our rural medical grants, scholarship housing, and emergency clinics would never have existed. Tonight, we are honored that you have finally agreed to stand before us." Every eye in the ballroom turned toward Grace. The same woman Caroline had almost redirected to a side lobby. The same woman Ethan had met in a storm wearing mud-splashed boots. Grace did not react with triumph. She did not smirk, did not rush, did not savor the humiliation spreading across polished faces. She simply adjusted the strap of her purse and walked forward at an unhurried pace. Her heels made soft measured clicks against the marble, and each step seemed to deepen the silence. Ethan stared as fragments slammed together in his mind with unnerving clarity. G. the Miller. The unsigned patent release 5 years ago that had saved Whitmore Industries millions during the hospital equipment lawsuit. G. the Miller. The private winter grants that quietly kept 15 rural clinics open when federal funding collapsed. G. the Miller. The anonymous donor the board had mythologized into some elusive trust or corporate shell because no one could imagine one ordinary woman choosing to remain unseen. Caroline finally found her voice. "There must be some mistake." The words came out thin and brittle. Several guests looked at her, then quickly away, sensing that proximity to her embarrassment had become dangerous. The chairman frowned slightly from the stage. "Mistake? Hardly. Miss Miller's legal office confirmed attendance this afternoon." Legal office. Another ripple moved through the room. Grace reached the foot of the stage, and the chairman descended personally to greet her with both hands, a gesture he had never once offered minor donors. "Grace," he said, smiling with unmistakable affection, "after all these years." She returned a modest nod. "I prefer quiet entrances." A few nervous laughs fluttered and died immediately. Ethan descended the last steps of the staircase almost without feeling his feet. His chest felt strangely hollow, as if the certainty with which he normally entered every room had been removed piece by piece. This woman had restarted his car in the rain, bought dinner for a hungry veteran, refused his money, and allowed his assistant to talk to her like a misplaced applicant while never once mentioning that half the charitable reputation attached to his family name existed because of her hidden generosity. He stopped 6 feet from her, unable to look anywhere else. Grace finally turned and met his eyes. There was no accusation there, which somehow made it worse. No satisfaction. No resentment. Just the same calm steadiness she had carried on the roadside. The chairman continued speaking into the microphone, now listing numbers that made donors murmur under their breath. $28 million in direct anonymous healthcare funding. 12 patent transfers donated royalty-free to non-profit manufacturers. Scholarship trust underwriting in 6 states. Each figure landed like another stone in the room's stomach. Wealth recognized greater wealth, but what unsettled them more was that it had arrived in a navy dress without diamonds and had waited patiently while being told it did not belong. Ethan heard someone near the front whisper, "That is Grace Miller." Another answered, "I thought she was a consultant." Caroline took one involuntary step backward. Her polished confidence had cracked completely now, and for the first time all evening, she looked small. Grace accepted the microphone only when the chairman offered it. She glanced once around the ballroom, over tuxedos, sequins, crystal, and stunned faces, then spoke in the same quiet voice Ethan had heard beside a dead engine in the rain. "It is interesting," she said, "how often a room decides who matters before asking who they are." No one breathed. The silence after Grace Miller's sentence was not the polite silence of wealthy people waiting for applause. It was the heavy, exposed silence of people realizing they had just participated in something ugly. Several guests lowered their eyes. One woman near the donor table slowly removed her champagne glass from her lips without taking a sip. Caroline Pierce stood frozen near the entrance, tablet hanging uselessly at her side, while Ethan Whitmore felt every carefully polished inch of his ballroom suddenly look less like prestige and more like a stage set built on assumptions. Grace held the microphone loosely, not like someone hungry for attention, but like someone willing to use exactly as many words as truth required. For 10 years, she continued, I asked that my name stay off every plaque, every brochure, and every fundraising speech because the clinics we funded were never supposed to be about me. Sick children in rural counties do not care whose name is etched on marble. Families sleeping in cars do not need donor galas. They need heat, medicine, and someone who notices them before it is too late. The words were quiet, but each one landed with surgical precision. No theatrics. No raised voice. Somehow that made them impossible to escape. Ethan watched the donors shift uncomfortably. These were people accustomed to being praised for generosity, not reminded of the distance between charitable image and actual compassion. Grace turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room until it rested, for just a moment, on Caroline. Unfortunately, she said, institutions often become mirrors of the people running them. If dignity is only offered to those dressed correctly, connected correctly, or listed correctly, then it is not dignity at all. It is branding. A faint gasp moved through the front tables. Caroline's lips parted, but no sound came out. Ethan had sat through aggressive shareholder confrontations with less tension than this. Because this was not a financial attack. It was moral exposure, and those wounds bled inward. The chairman, sensing both discomfort and significance, stepped back and wisely said nothing. Grace lowered the microphone slightly. Yesterday, I met a man on a highway who could not start his car. A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the ballroom as heads turned toward Ethan almost in unison. Grace continued before anyone could process it. He wore an expensive watch, drove an expensive car, and looked exactly like someone the world rushes to help. But stranded is stranded. Rain does not ask for your net worth. Ethan felt heat rise behind his collar. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, yet standing there while this simple woman described him in front of his own donor class made him feel startlingly transparent. Grace's eyes met his. So I stopped. Because help should not require a resume. The room remained motionless. Ethan remembered every detail with painful clarity now, his hesitation, his skepticism, the money he tried to hand her like closure. Caroline's card slid across the diner table, the phrase. Reimbursement expenses. It all sounded uglier when replayed beneath chandeliers. Grace turned back to the audience. Tonight, I was offered a side lobby for community visitors. Several guests inhaled sharply. Someone near the rear muttered, "My God." Caroline closed her eyes for half a second as though willing herself invisible. Grace did not linger on her humiliation. She simply stated it, and that restraint made the indictment more devastating. I say this not because I am offended, Grace said. I have been underestimated before. I will survive it again. I say it because somewhere outside this ballroom are people who will never hold this microphone, never reveal a donor file, never be announced by a chairman. They will simply be dismissed. And if that becomes normal in a place built to serve others, then the foundation has forgotten its own foundation. No one applauded. They were too stunned for applause. Ethan looked around and saw something he rarely saw in rooms like this, shame without escape routes. His family crest hung above the ballroom archway, gold against white stone, and for the first time in his adult life it felt less like a symbol of legacy and more like a question mark aimed directly at him. Grace handed the microphone back to the chairman, but before stepping away, she said one final sentence, softer than all the rest. Money can build hospitals. Character decides who gets welcomed through the front door. And in that moment, Ethan Whitmore knew that every powerful person in the room was waiting to see what he would do next. Ethan Whitmore did not move for 2 full seconds after Grace Miller stepped away from the microphone. In boardrooms, hesitation was dangerous. In public relations, silence could become a headline. But this was something rarer than business risk. This was the naked moment when a man sees his own reflection stripped of every flattering angle. He looked at Grace standing quietly beside the chairman, hands folded, face calm, as if she had not just dismantled an entire ballroom with nothing but measured truth. Then Ethan did something no one in Whitmore Hall expected from a man of his stature. He walked down from the staircase, crossed the marble floor in front of donors, senators, executives, and cameras, and stopped directly in front of her. The room held its breath. Caroline Pierce looked as though the floor beneath her heels had disappeared. Ethan turned first, not to Grace, but to the microphone stand. He lifted it himself. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice, though steady, carried none of its usual executive Polish. "I owe this woman more than thanks for restarting my car yesterday." A murmur moved through the crowd. Ethan continued. "I owe her an apology. A public one. Because while I did not stop her at the entrance myself, this building, this event, and this foundation operate under my name. Which means every quiet act of dismissal committed here belongs to me whether I witnessed it or not." Several board members shifted visibly. This was not on the schedule. Ethan looked toward Caroline. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. "Miss Pierce," he said, "effective immediately, you are relieved of guest operations and donor relations pending a full board review." Caroline inhaled sharply. "Ethan, please, I was only following admission protocol." Ethan met her eyes with a calmness more devastating than anger. Admission protocol that cannot recognize the person who built this institution is not protocol. It is arrogance with a clipboard. The words landed hard. Caroline lowered her gaze, her confidence finally collapsing under the weight of a room that no longer stood with her. Ethan then turned back to Grace. For the first time since anyone in that ballroom had met him, he looked uncertain. "Human. Yesterday on that highway," he said quietly, though the microphone carried every word, "you stopped for a stranger when you had no reason to. In that diner, you fed a veteran while I sat there thinking generosity was measured in larger checks. And tonight, after being treated with less respect than many of us give our caterers, you still chose to tell the truth without humiliating anyone by name." Grace said nothing. Ethan swallowed once. "I have spent years believing leadership meant building bigger institutions. You reminded me in 24 hours. That leadership begins with smaller things. Doors. Tables. The way people are spoken to before anyone knows what they can offer in return." The room had gone completely still again, but this silence felt different. Not scandal. Reflection. Ethan extended his hand. "Miss Miller, on behalf of every person in this hall who benefited from your generosity without deserving your patience, I am sorry." Grace looked at his outstretched hand for a brief moment, then took it. Her handshake was simple, firm, and entirely without performance. A camera flashed somewhere in the back, but no one cared about photographs now. Grace leaned slightly toward the microphone Ethan still held and spoke one last time. "Then let this place become the kind of room where the next unknown person does not need a donor file to be treated with dignity." Ethan nodded slowly. "It will." And for once, people believed him. Later that evening, the gala resumed, but nothing about it felt the same. Donors spoke more softly. Staff members were thanked by name. The Veteran Clinic Fund exceeded its goal before dessert was served. Yet the most lasting image from that night was not the chandeliers, the speeches, or the record-breaking pledges. It was the memory of a simple woman in a navy dress who had stood at the front door, been measured as insignificant, and then quietly reminded an empire that true worth never arrives announced. Sometimes it pulls over on the side of a stormy highway in an old pickup truck, asks if you need help, and leaves behind a lesson money cannot buy.